In September 1944, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower sat in his headquarters and read a message that made his blood boil. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the commander of British forces in Europe, had just sent him a letter demanding that Eisenhower give him total control of the Allied ground forces. Montgomery claimed that Eisenhower was incompetent to lead the campaign and that only he, Montgomery, could win the war. Eisenhower put down the letter and considered his options. He could fire Montgomery on the spot. He had the authority. He had the cause. And frankly, he had wanted to do it for months. But firing Montgomery would create a crisis that could tear the Allied coalition apart. Churchill would be furious. The British public would be outraged. The partnership that had won the war so far might collapse just as victory was within reach. For the next several weeks, the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery would reach a breaking point. Secret meetings would be held. Ultimatums would be delivered. Careers would hang in the balance. This is the story of how the two most powerful Allied commanders in Europe nearly destroyed their alliance in the middle of the war, and how one of them barely kept his job. The conflict between Eisenhower and Montgomery did not begin in 1944. It had been building since the day they first met. Dwight Eisenhower was a staff officer who had never commanded troops in combat before World War II. He had spent most of his career behind a desk, planning operations and managing logistics. When he was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, many professional soldiers were skeptical. Some were openly contemptuous. Bernard Montgomery was everything Eisenhower was not. He was a combat veteran who had led troops in World War I. He had won the Battle of El Alamein, the first major British victory against German forces. He was aggressive, confident, and absolutely certain of his own genius. Montgomery made no secret of his opinion that Eisenhower was out of his depth. He believed that a professional soldier, meaning himself, should be making the tactical decisions. Eisenhower's job should be limited to political coordination and supply management. Eisenhower tolerated this attitude because he had no choice. Montgomery was a British national hero. Churchill adored him. The British public worshipped him. Removing him would cause a political crisis that could damage the entire Allied war effort. So Eisenhower smiled and nodded and tried to work with a subordinate who barely concealed his contempt. The tension exploded into open conflict after the Normandy invasion. The original plan for the Normandy campaign gave Montgomery command of all Allied ground forces during the initial phase of the invasion. This made sense when the beachhead was small and coordination was critical. But as the campaign progressed and American forces grew to outnumber British forces, the arrangement became increasingly awkward. By August 1944, there were far more American soldiers in France than British soldiers. The American public was asking why their boys were taking orders from a British general. American commanders were chafing under Montgomery's leadership. Eisenhower decided to take personal command of the ground forces on September 1st. Montgomery would continue to command the British and Canadian forces, but he would no longer be in charge of the Americans. A new command structure would give Eisenhower direct control over the entire campaign. Montgomery was furious. He saw Eisenhower's decision as a personal insult and a strategic disaster. He believed that the Allied forces needed a single ground commander to coordinate their movements, and he believed that commander should be him. Montgomery sent letter after letter to Eisenhower arguing against the change. He demanded meetings. He lobbied Churchill. He did everything in his power to reverse the decision. Eisenhower refused. The change went into effect as scheduled, but Montgomery did not give up. Instead, he began a campaign to undermine Eisenhower's strategy and prove that his own approach was superior. The disagreement was not just about personalities. It was about how to win the war. Eisenhower favored what he called the broad front strategy. Allied forces would advance across the entire front, from the North Sea to Switzerland. This approach was slower but safer. It prevented the Germans from concentrating their forces against a single thrust. It kept all the Allied armies engaged and moving forward together. Montgomery wanted a narrow thrust. He proposed concentrating the majority of Allied supplies and reinforcements behind a single powerful attack, driving straight through Belgium and into the heart of Germany. He believed this approach could end the war by Christmas 1944. The catch, of course, was that Montgomery wanted his forces to lead this attack. The Americans would be reduced to a supporting role, holding the flanks while the British won the war. Eisenhower rejected the narrow thrust strategy. He believed it was too risky. A single thrust could be cut off and destroyed. The supply lines would be vulnerable, and politically it was impossible to tell the American public that their soldiers would sit idle while the British got the glory. Montgomery accused Eisenhower of being too cautious, too political, and too incompetent to understand military strategy. He continued to demand that his approach be adopted. In September 1944, Eisenhower made a partial concession. He approved Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's ambitious plan to capture bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands using airborne forces. If successful, it would open a path into northern Germany. Montgomery finally had his chance to prove that bold action could win the war. Operation Market Garden was launched on September 17, 1944. It was the largest airborne operation in history. 3 divisions of paratroopers dropped behind German lines to capture a series of bridges, while ground forces raced forward to link up with them. The operation was a disaster. The plan was too ambitious. The intelligence was flawed. German resistance was far stronger than expected. The final bridge at Arnhem proved to be, in the famous phrase, a bridge too far. British paratroopers at Arnhem were surrounded and nearly annihilated. Of the roughly 10,000 men who landed there, fewer than 2,000 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. Operation Market Garden cost the Allies nearly 17,000 casualties. It failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives, and it proved that Montgomery's bold approach was not the guaranteed path to victory he had claimed. Eisenhower expected that the failure would humble Montgomery. He expected an acknowledgement that the narrow thrust strategy had been tested and found wanting. Instead, Montgomery blamed everyone except himself. He blamed the weather. He blamed the intelligence officers. He blamed the American units that had supposedly moved too slowly. He blamed Eisenhower for not giving him enough resources. What he never did was admit that his plan had been flawed from the beginning. Eisenhower was running out of patience. By December 1944, the relationship between Eisenhower and Montgomery had deteriorated to the point of open hostility. Montgomery continued to criticize Eisenhower's strategy in letters, in meetings, and worst of all, in conversations with British officials and journalists. Then came the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest. American lines collapsed. For several terrifying days, it seemed like the Germans might actually split the Allied armies and reach the vital port of Antwerp. Eisenhower responded quickly. He recognized that the German attack had created a bulge in the Allied lines, with American forces on both the north and south sides of the penetration. To improve coordination, he temporarily placed the American forces north of the bulge under Montgomery's command. It was a sensible military decision. Montgomery was closer to those units and could coordinate their movements more effectively than commanders further south. But Montgomery saw it as vindication. He began telling anyone who would listen that he had saved the Americans from disaster. He implied that Eisenhower's strategy had caused the crisis, and that only his intervention had prevented catastrophe. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference that nearly ended his career. Standing before reporters, Montgomery described the Battle of the Bulge in terms that made it sound like a British victory. He talked about how he had taken command of the battle and restored order to the chaos. He praised the American soldiers as brave fighters while implying that their commanders had failed them. The American press exploded with outrage. Headlines accused Montgomery of claiming credit for an American battle. Generals Bradley and Patton were furious. They demanded that Eisenhower do something about Montgomery's insufferable arrogance. Eisenhower had finally had enough. He drafted a message to the combined chiefs of staff, the body that oversaw all Allied operations. The message presented an ultimatum. Either Montgomery would be removed from command or Eisenhower would resign. It was the nuclear option. Eisenhower was betting his career on the belief that the Allied leadership would choose him over Montgomery. The message was never sent. Before Eisenhower could transmit his ultimatum, Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Guingamp, learned what was about to happen. De Guingamp was a diplomat as well as a soldier. He had spent years smoothing over the conflicts that Montgomery created. De Guingamp rushed to Eisenhower's headquarters and begged for time. He promised that he could fix the situation. He asked Eisenhower to hold the message for 24 hours. Eisenhower agreed, but he made clear that this was Montgomery's last chance. De Guingamp then flew to Montgomery's headquarters and delivered the news. For once in his life, Montgomery was shocked into silence. He had not realized how close he had come to destruction. He had not understood that his behavior had pushed Eisenhower to the breaking point. De Guingamp told Montgomery that he had to apologize immediately and completely. There could be no excuses, no qualifications, no attempts to justify his actions. Only total submission would save his career. Montgomery, faced with the choice between his pride and his command, chose his command. He wrote a letter to Eisenhower that was remarkable for its humility. He apologized for the press conference. He pledged his complete loyalty. He asked Eisenhower to tear up any gruesome messages and to regard the matter as closed. Eisenhower accepted the apology. The message to the combined chiefs was never sent. Montgomery kept his command, but the relationship was never the same. For the remaining months of the war, Montgomery was notably more cooperative. He still disagreed with Eisenhower's decisions, but he kept his disagreements private. He stopped giving press conferences. He focused on commanding his forces rather than undermining his supreme commander. The Allied coalition held together, and on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. After the war, both men wrote memoirs that revealed the depth of their mutual frustration. Eisenhower's account was diplomatic, but made clear that working with Montgomery had been one of the great challenges of his career. Montgomery's memoirs were characteristically blunt, continuing to criticize Eisenhower's strategic decisions even decades after the war ended. The question of who was right about strategy remains debated by historians. Some believe that Montgomery's narrow thrust could have ended the war earlier if properly supported. Others argue that Eisenhower's cautious approach was the only responsible choice given the risks involved. But one thing is clear. In January 1945, the Allied coalition came within hours of a rupture that could have changed the course of the war. Two proud men, each convinced of his own rightness, nearly destroyed the partnership that was winning the war. Eisenhower showed remarkable restraint in not firing Montgomery earlier. He tolerated insults and insubordination that would have ended any other general's career. He did this because he understood that the alliance was more important than his personal feelings. Montgomery showed remarkable blindness in not recognizing how close he came to disaster. It took the intervention of his own chief of staff to make him understand that his behavior had consequences. The partnership between America and Britain won World War II, but that partnership was more fragile than most people realize. It survived the egos of its commanders, but just barely. Sometimes the most important battles are not fought against the enemy. They are fought between allies who must find a way to work together despite their differences. Eisenhower and Montgomery fought that battle for 3 years. They both won, but neither of them enjoyed it. If you want to hear more stories like this, consider subscribing to the channel. We uncover the untold stories of World War II, the ones that history books left out. See you in the next video.